Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Stuart DeQ. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, which is a joint initiative in the School of Management and the School of the Environment. Today is really special. We've got Tony and Mark here for a fireside chat. And, this is part of the Peter Straus lecture series. Peter Straus, a pioneer in public service radio, and the lecture series presents talks by prominent individuals on topics that relate to the press and public responsibility. And it's really a rare treat to then have a fireside chat and a conversation between two people with decades of experience, influence, expertise, and an insatiable curiosity for covering and illuminating our most important story of all of our lifetimes. And they're friends and colleagues, and they've been doing this for a long time. So I love fireside chats or conversations where you can feel the warmth and connection between people over a long period of time. And you actually feel like you're being let in. Like there should be actually a fire here. You kind of are all disappearing, and they're actually the ones who are having that conversation. And Mark brings decades of experience in the space. He's a writer. You'll find him writing books. See this huge kind of list of books that he's read. You'll also hear him on public radio, writing for the nation, and then building networks of other climate journalists. And we'll talk about this in depth. He's co-founder and executive director of the global media collaboration covering climate now, and an environmental correspondent for the nation. And he's covered climate change since 1989. And the list of books and places that he's doing this is vast. So he's going to probably touch on all of these at different points in the conversation, and I'll list them all out here. And then Tony, who is going to be leading this conversation. So Yale is like a medieval village with no map. And sometimes you go wander around and you can't find all these places and spots that are there. The Yale program on climate change communication, which Tony leads, you have seen in almost every article that you've read on climate change at different points cited for their work on climate opinion. They are really the most influential backbone organization for incredibly solid information, data, and consistent kind of coverage that people can utilize in climate change. And they're here, they're in the fourth floor of St. Paul over at the School of Environment, and people don't find them early enough. And I know some people just come here for 2 or 3 years, but there's a vast world-class research that sits right here, which I would really encourage people to tap into. So you're going to have a lovely hour here. We're deeply appreciative of these two folks for being here. Tony, I'll kick it over to you to start the conversation. But Mark, really thanks for making the time to come up and share your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Stuart. Such a very kind introduction, and welcome to all of you, and in particular, welcome to my good old friend, Mark Hertsgaard. We have been in conversation like this for probably close to 17 to 20 years. So mostly I hope what we're going to ultimately get to is that you're going to parachute into an ongoing conversation that we've been having for a long time. But really...
We've never had a fight.
Yeah, so far. Maybe this is the moment. Let's just start with, first of all, of course, we're here to talk about climate change coverage and so on. And so I'm not going to talk much about climate change. I presume everybody knows the importance of this particular issue. By the way, are we all hearing an echo? Yes. Okay. Okay, good.
Is it this? This may still be turned on.
Okay. Would it help if I turn this off and just... Nope. Okay. Bear with us. So anyway, Mark, let's just start with you, actually, because you've been a long-time reporter. And so could you say a little bit more about your own journey as to coming to recognize and devote your life to climate coverage, which is pretty unusual for a journalist. So can you just say a little bit about your own path to this?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Tony, for having me. Thank you all for being here. I spoke at Yale many years ago, a number of times, in the School of Religion and Ethics. Mm-hmm. And that was after I wrote a book called Earth Odyssey, which was about traveling around the world to investigate the world's, the humanities' environmental future. So it's nice to be back at Yale. I've never been in the management school. I guess that, how did I get into that? I grew up on a farm. And so when you grow up on a farm, nature is part of your life. And very early on, it was clear to me that the environment was sort of what's the German word comes to me, a Grundsache, the foundation of all the other issues. If you don't get that one right, nothing else is going to matter. And so from a young age, I was interested in questions of the environment. My first book was a book about the nuclear power industry. And then how I got into climate, I guess, and environment was that I was, well, it's all just come full circle. My second book was a book called On Bended Knee, The Press and the Reagan Presidency. And that was kind of what made my reputation. I started writing for the New Yorker magazine. And it was an investigative book about how the Reagan administration had gotten such fabulously positive press during its 8 years. And the conventional narrative in Washington was that, oh, Reagan was a master manipulator of the press, and he was a PR genius and a great communicator. And I did 175 interviews with most of the people in the media and discovered that, you know, they were good inside the White House, but the real thing that was happening was that the press was censoring itself. And they censored itself. The big famous story there was that the CBS corporate brass had sat on Leslie Stahl when she was the White House correspondent for supposedly being too, oh, great, for supposedly being, can you all still hear us in the back? Nod your head. Yeah, great. For supposedly being too critical of the president. And that was because corporate America had taken over CBS. And they wanted to stay on the side of good side of Reagan. We'll get back into that later because that's a big part of why your TV news today is so shallow. It used to be that you had to lose money in the TV business because it was part of how you kept your license. Ronald Reagan came in and deregulated television, and television news became a profit center, which is why you see all that chitter-chatter, and they're trying to talk when you see them on the air, and they're trying to act like they're your Uncle Tom or Aunt Mary. And that all started back then. So that book taught me a lot about how the media worked. And then a guy named Bill McKibben, who probably a lot of you know, Bill was at the New Yorker at that time too, and he wrote the first and still the best book, I think, if you're just getting into climate change, to read, The End of Nature. And I reviewed that, I think, for Mother Jones magazine, and once I read that, it was like, whoa. Because I had been covering nuclear stuff, and I covered that in my Reagan book, and those are the two issues, it's nuclear war, and those are still the two issues, nuclear war or climate and environment. And so from there, I spent most of the 1990s traveling around the world to investigate the environmental future, and once you do that, and I've now reported on these issues from 25 countries around the world, you see that there's again, everything depends on that, and McKibben actually has a nice way of saying this, that on most issues, there is not a time limit, right? On, say, poverty or abortion or income inequality or whatever it may be, housing. You have the political fights, you make your best effort, and maybe you don't get there this year, but you can come back next year. You can come back next election and, get a little bit more. Not with climate. With climate, as Bill says quite rightly, winning slowly is the same as losing because there is a real time limit. You get to a point, and we're very close to that point already, where the temperatures are so high that it basically becomes self-reinforcing. So that's why I felt like I've had to, I've been lucky to write about a lot of other things too. I wrote a book on the Beatles, so you do need a break from this stuff every once in a while, for sure. But especially once I became a dad, there was no question. So I, in fact, wrote another book about how my daughter, who's now going to be 19 tomorrow, how her generation, which is your generation, how are you going to live through the next 50 years on Earth? And that's a book called Hot. So that's probably more than enough.
Oh, that's great. And look, I already learned that we both grew up on farms, so we'll have to.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I brought a map. I grew up right here.
Have to ask, which state were you?
That's the state of Michigan.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, my folks.
But does know that this is the map of Michigan. Right?
Yeah, my folks are from Minnesota, but we grew up in Maryland.
All right. So, all right, let's come back to this. So, and I'll just add a little bit of data to the context of this question. But so we study public opinion, public responses to climate change here in the United States and around the world. And just to set a little context, we know that in our latest global scale study, we still find that there's about 4 out of 10 adults worldwide who know little to nothing about climate change. As in, like, they've never even heard of it before, which is roughly 2 billion people. And they're often the most vulnerable, the people who have contributed the least to the problem but are absolutely getting hit first and worst. However, that doesn't mean they're not keenly aware of changes in their local climates. They are aware. They know that temperatures are changing. They know that precipitation patterns are changing. They know that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and severe. They know that growing seasons are shifting because their lives literally depend on these things in a way that they don't for those of us who work in air-conditioned offices and homes. So we still have a fundamental need to even raise basic awareness among a big chunk of the world's population. And yet, even in the developed world, where everyone basically has heard of climate change, there's still a huge lack of understanding that it's human-caused, and even more importantly, a lack of appreciating the threat itself. In fact, many people still think of this as distant in time and space. They don't understand that it's time-limited. They don't understand that there are critical thresholds in the system that once crossed, you don't get to come back. Like,
there's no do-overs.
There's no do-overs. Like, once the system has shifted and changed, you don't get to say, okay, now we're going to stop emissions, because at that point it is too late. So we have a lot to do there. But here's the question. In the meantime, the world's communication system has radically changed. Okay? And we can get into the business side of this, given that we're here. That's certainly a big part of the story. But it's not just that the news media itself has fragmented and become more partisan and all these kinds of things. But the sources of news, the sources of information have radically shifted. I mean, I was just seeing today that 1/3 of young people today say that their primary source of news and information is TikTok. So my question to you then is, I mean, I'm treating you as the representative of the traditional media here, which is funny to put you in that position as a longstanding critic of it. But what is the role of the traditional media in this landscape? And how does covering climate now fit into that?
Yeah, let me start with what the role of the media is supposed to be in the American system. There is a reason that the press is the only institution that is explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Freedom of the press is guaranteed. Why is that? That's because the founders realized and believed strongly that you cannot have a democracy without an informed public. And you cannot have an informed public unless there is a vibrant, independent, free, and diverse press. You have to have people able to, and news institutions able to discuss the issues of the day so that the citizens can be informed. James Madison has a line, in fact, I used it as the quote at the start of my very first book. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. That's why the press is enshrined in the Constitution. That's what we're supposed to be doing. That is not what we're doing today, and it is there's too many different reasons to describe why that is. One of them, though, is what I talked about earlier with television. It used to be that TV news, for all of its flaws, I wrote about them extensively in the Reagan book. Nevertheless, they at least adhered to that in their minds, that we have to inform the public. And I should say, my father was a TV newsman. He was the anchorman. He was known as the Walter Cronkite of Baltimore. That's probably a name that doesn't mean much to you guys because you're not the right generation. Walter Cronkite was the most powerful and influential news anchor at CBS for many years, and my dad was that. And he was a conservative Republican, but he believed in treating the news seriously. and covering the news, and you let the public make up their own minds. You don't tell them what to think, but you darn sure make sure that they have the information so that they can think. That used to be true up until the Reagan years. And then, because Reagan deregulated TV news became a profit center, just like the rest of television. And since this is a business school, we should talk about why that is. Why was TV news supposed to not make money? Literally, you were supposed to lose money. In fact, I had this in an interview. Why? Because you're using the public airwaves under the 1934 Federal Communications Act. And ABC, CBS, NBC were making such obscene, this was not my word, the word of my CBS source who was saying this, such obscene amounts of money on your sports and entertainment programming that in order to keep your license at the end of the year, you had to be able to say, but look, we're doing all this public service broadcasting. So there used to be serious documentaries. When is the last time you saw a serious documentary come out of any of the major networks? It doesn't happen. There used to be serious investigative accountability reporting. Earth Day, the very first Earth Day, 1970, in fact, we wrote about this 2 years ago, it was, again, Cronkite, but also NBC and ABC, full bore saying, this is not right, we're ruining the planet, we've got to, and putting activists on the screen and basically saying that they're right. That has all changed, and that's because now, over the last, 35 years, TV news is a profit center. It's a profit center. And so you, instead of getting the news that you need as a citizen, you get the news that you want as a consumer. And, if you ask, it's like asking kids, do you want extra ice cream tonight? Every night they're going to say yes, right? Same with news, right? Do you want to have that serious news? Well, no, I'd rather watch whatever, the Duke North Carolina game. But so that's been lost. And I think that's probably the biggest problem. And then the second thing is that, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody here, but Google and Facebook and that crowd stole the revenue out of news. And the news media in general did not respond very intelligently to that theft. They all dropped their paywalls, and they acted like, news should be free. And guess what? In life, you get what you pay for. And when you take free news and that this is the only place you get your news, you're not going to be very well informed. The one exception, again, since we're in a business school, there's one exception. Wall Street Journal never dropped their paywall. Never did. Why not? Because they knew that their product was valuable enough that people would pay for it. But people were paying for that of a very self-interested reason, right? You can make money off of what you read in the Wall Street Journal if you're an investor. But that's not the way citizens look at it, right? Especially when you've got a country where 40% of the citizenry is barely one paycheck away from disaster, right? If they can reduce the amount of money that they're going to have to pay for news, believe me, they still need and want news, but they get crappy news. So those are, I think, some of the things that we're sort of swimming upstream against. And as you asked about climate change, or Covering Climate Now. So Covering Climate Now is the name of the organization. There's a global media consortium that I co-founded and with Bill Moyers, the great PBS newsman for many years, who was a sparkling exception to all these trends I'm talking about. So Bill and myself and Kyle Pope, who was running the Columbia Journalism Review, which is the authoritative voice of media criticism, based at Columbia, obviously, and then my colleague at The Nation magazine, Katrina vanden Heuvel. We started Covering Climate Now 5 years ago. And we did it in order to break what I call the climate silence that was existing throughout the mainstream media. It's hard to realize now, because it's 5 years later, it was silent in this country. And you probably have studied this, but you could not see in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, LA Times. Time magazine was a virtuous exception, but ABC, NBC, CBS, even PBS, almost no mention of climate change, right? Up to very, very recently, 5 years ago. And so that was why we started this organization, was to break that climate silence. And it was striking. Again, because I've spent so much of my career overseas, and I've reported on climate change now from 25 countries, and I've worked for a lot of news outlets in Europe and Asia. So I know what my colleagues are thinking and what they're reporting. And every time I would come back through the United States in my travels, starting in the 1990s, it was so discouraging because the climate conversation was 10 years behind Europe. The climate conversation in the political class and therefore in the media coverage, because most media coverage just mirrors what's going on in the political class. And it was silent here. It was silent. Or when it wasn't silent, it was both sidesing. So you'd have, on the one hand, an eminent NASA scientist like James Hansen would be sitting here, and over here would be a scientist from ExxonMobil who, maybe had studied a chemistry class as an undergraduate, but had, basically spent his life as a paid propagandist. And the news was presenting those as equally important views. So that was why we founded Covering Climate Now.
So many different ways we could go from here, but let's unpack that a little bit. So I don't think people yet understand what Covering Climate Now actually is and what it does.
So as I say, we wanted to break the climate silence. And I knew also from my time around the world that there were a lot of reporters and editors who knew better in this country, and who were frustrated, as I was. And I thought, if we can bring them together into a critical mass, we can grow that critical mass, because we can show them you're not alone, and there's a lot of us who feel this way, and therefore we can go to our editors and to management and say, look, you've got to do better. And this is before we had your data, frankly, to say, hey, the public wants this. Our message was much more, come on, you're in journalism, hopefully for a reason. If you want to go make money, go work on Wall Street. That's not what we do. I mean, we should be paid, but I always like to say, we're paid poorly, but paid by our employers, but we work for the public. That's what the press does. And we were failing miserably on that. And so, indeed, we pulled together because of the Columbia Journalism Review, and Columbia happens to be what gives out the Pulitzer Prizes. So every journalist, in fact, I was very sneaky about this. I would, we'd be inviting people and writing, and you put in the subject line, invitation from Columbia Journalism School, ? And everybody thinks, oh, Pulitzer? I better read that. And so we pulled together a conference, and we decided, and there were enough people there who said, yeah, okay, let's do this. And so we pulled together, we said, okay, let's have a week of common coverage, and let's all just spend a week, and we'll all do coverage together, and we'll push the climate story up the agenda. And we thought there'd be like a couple dozen news organizations. I remember the Philadelphia Inquirer was the very first. It was, the very first after The Nation and Columbia Journalism Review. We were the founders. And then The Guardian was technically the first, because they helped sponsor that conference, and WNYC, the NPR station in New York. So we were the 4 founders. But then the Philadelphia Inquirer editors stood up at that conference. We're in. I thought, oh, you might get a dozen, 2 dozen. But then a story got out in Columbia Journalism Review, and I think the Times did a small story. And then Bloomberg joined. And then CBS joined. And once those 2 things happened, it was like it gave permission for the rest of the straight mainstream media to say, oh, we can do this too. This is not just activists. Because that was one of the things you heard for many years as a reporter, that, wait, you want to cover climate change? Oh, you must be an activist. We don't do that in this newsroom, right? That changed that. And so we say at Covering Climate Now, we are a collaboration of journalists. We're organized by journalists, for journalists, which means no activists, no government officials, no PR people, just professionals working with one another, helping each other to do more and better coverage. And we do that in 1,000 different ways, including things like having a week of common coverage, as we did that September of 2019. And by the time we got to that September, after having thought, oh, maybe we'll have a couple dozen news organizations, we had 323. And they reached a combined audience of billions of people around the world, because we had the Agence France Press news agency, which delivers content to hundreds, thousands really, of news outlets around the world. We had Bloomberg, as I mentioned, which reaches about 100 million around the world. And we had Times of India, which when they were signing up to join us, I had a standard question I would ask. So, how often do you do climate coverage? what's your audience? And this woman writes back and she says, well, I do a story about every week or two. And as for our audience, the Times of India reaches slightly more than 1 billion people a month, which I hope will suffice. And I said, I think that will suffice. So we did that week of coverage, and then we got very, very lucky. And it's why, the rule of journalism is put your feet on the ground and get out there and watch what happens, see what happens. Because that Friday of our week, a young Swedish teenager named Greta Thunberg put 6+ million people in the streets around the world, protesting the lack of action and attention to this issue. And the combination of that activism with this surge of coverage on the part of news organizations around the world, that together, and this is a lesson for all of it going forward, that together changed how government leaders, and I must say news media leaders, looked at climate change. You realize, oh my God, this is real. This is something we have to pay attention to. And so that changed everything. And ever since then, we continue to do that. We can talk about how we do that, but I hope that gives a sense of how we work. And we continue to do that to this day. So we're 5 years in.
So first of all, I'm glad you said the James Madison quote about the importance of an informed and knowledgeable citizenry, because we think that's actually partly what we do here in education. So
Absolutely.
It's a shared mission in that sense. I want to pick up on one of the things that you noticed there, because it's a general principle that's true of all humans, including news anchors and news directors and news owners and CEOs and political leaders and so on, is that we are social animals. We are very much influenced by what everybody else around us is doing. This is the role of what we call social norms. And it turns out that executives are no different. So this idea of breaking the climate silence, which for many communities still exists, where people just don't talk about it because they're afraid or they misbelieve that half or more of their community members are climate deniers. It's not true. They're just loud, and they're very vocal, and they tend to bully everybody and intimidate people into climate silence. And that works out in the boardroom just like it happens in everyday life. And so that's like you said, when Bloomberg joined, when CBS joined, suddenly it was safe.
Yeah, exactly.
People start going into the pool and they go, oh, it's warm in here. It's okay.
Yeah.
We won't die. Okay?
And I have to brag on your work for a bit here too, because your work is the first thing we cite when we sit down in those meetings. And right now we are training local TV stations at NBC and CBS across the country that reach millions of people. But the very first meeting we had with CBS, I was saying to them, they said, look, we're happy you came. And I said, well, I'm glad to be here. I think you should know that, I'm sure you do know that there's nothing that television needs more than a younger audience. And you're not going to have any credibility with that younger audience if you're not covering this. But now we can say, you have to cover this because people want it, right? And that's what they care about. They are, as I said before, now it's a profit-driven news operation. So when I can say to them, everybody wants it, and they always like, well, what about all the people who don't? And then I can say, well, Yale says that it's 11%. 11% of the national, and that's nationwide. Tony knows the differences, locally. They're not that big differences. 11%. And so I can say to these people...
Are dismissive of climate change.
Yeah, deniers or whatever. And so I can say to these people in these private meetings, if you are letting that 11% silence you, you're leaving 89 cents out of the dollar on the table. Is that good business? I don't think so. And that's your work. And that is the very first thing we say so that we can then get on to teaching them how to cover climate change and how to make the connection to extreme weather and all of that. But we would not be having those conversations without your work. So,
thank you for that. But really, thank you back. Because what I'd like to, hopefully, and just take a quick poll of the room, what's your own sense? Do you feel like you're seeing climate change more in the news coverage? Raise your hand if you've, just over the past couple of years? Yeah. So that's not an accident, people. That's hard work. And we're not taking credit for it. I mean, Mark maybe can take more credit than me. But this is larger forces and a lot of people who are contributing this. But that's not an accident.
No. And it's also, let's be clear, they're not climate silent any longer, but they're still way too climate quiet. There's a guy named Tony Leiswich who has a good line about this. It says, on a scale of 1 to 10, they used to be a 1. Now they're a 2. And we need to be at an 11. We should be covering climate change like the emergency that science says it is. And that's been another issue that we've had to get across to them. Is like, it's an emergency according to the scientists, right? So we were very instrumental in the very first piece on network television that finally said this, and it said it last September. Chase Kane, if you're interested in following somebody who's really good, TV reporter, never let it be said TV can't do great reporting. Chase Kane, C-A-I-N. And he did a piece, 2 minutes, 4 seconds long, where he said he was in the streets with these protesters, and they're all sort of 20-somethings or late teenagers, demanding that Biden call it a climate emergency. And then he pivots to a stand-up and says, and that's not just hyperbole, and he holds up the scientific study. There's 14,000 scientists in a peer-reviewed study saying it's an emergency. Now, why does that matter, climate emergency rather than a problem? Again, it's because it gets back to that time-limited aspect. It's an emergency because we have to act very rapidly, or it's going to be too late. You can think of it in medical terms as like if you get a cancer diagnosis, nobody welcomes that, right? But if you go to the doctor the next day or 2 days later, it's probably not going to change your outcome very much. Whereas if you suddenly drop over from a heart attack, you can't wait till tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. You better get to the hospital in half an hour or you're not going to be there tomorrow. That's what we're facing now with the climate emergency. And that's what we're trying to get across, and we're still not there yet. I mean, yes, we have moved the needle, but boy, we've got a long ways to go. And so that's, I'm hoping that's something that all of you can help with, any of you who end up going into the media or in other respects, because again, as Tony says, the social norms, they watch what people are doing. And so when you see good coverage, send a note, send an email. That you would be surprised how important that is.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that. It turns out that saying thank you is really powerful because they almost never hear it.
Right.
Like if you see something you like, and not just the media, I mean, period. If you see a political leader doing something, like people are much more motivated to send them messages complaining about stuff that they don't like than to hear from their constituents about the things that they do like. And that means that any one person who then actually says thank you, you're standing out.
Yep.
Your message stands out. It's more powerful than all the ones that are complaining, because that's mostly what they see. So it's just to say you have lots of power. But I want to come back because, of course, the getting from here to the climate future that we need to get to, and let's also be clear, we've made tremendous progress over the past 10 to 15 years. So we have many miles to go before we sleep, but it's not that we haven't made tremendous progress already. But that's going to require not just individual level change, but systems change, which ultimately is driven by political change. So we've already talked about the state of public understanding around the world. We've touched on some of the key business dimensions and challenges in this issue. So let's turn to politics. Because it also turns out that this is not just about to be probably, again, the world's warmest year ever in recorded human history, but also one of the coolest years of the rest of your lives. So not only is this going to be a big year from a climate perspective, it's also the biggest democracy moment the world's ever seen. 4 out of 10 people on the planet are going to be voting this year. So what can you tell us about the political dimensions of this year?
I would say those people are eligible to vote. Whether they will be voting, again, is something that you can affect. Vote, vote, vote. If you're lucky enough to live in a democracy, for God's sake, vote. Help other people vote. Get them registered. Get them to the polls. Fight the people who are trying to restrict voting access. People died for the right to vote. It infuriates me when I hear people say, oh, I just don't care, and they're all the same. They are not all the same. And if you don't care, your freedom, your democracy will be taken away from you. You look at history, democracy is not a given. And freedom has to be fought for, and then it has to be sustained. So the message of Covering Climate Now this year is very much about these elections. And we're trying to help our colleagues in the media to cover the elections with a climate lens. Now, most of the time, too much of the news is just focused on what we call the horse race, the polls. And no offense, polls are important, but if that's all you're covering, you're not giving the public the power that knowledge gives. You're not telling them about, okay, here's what's going to happen if one political party wins or one particular nominee wins, and here's what would happen if the other does. You would think that should be standard journalistic practice, and I dare say, again, before the news became a profit center, it was. And you could argue about how well they did it, but at least they tried. So that's what we are pushing this year, and also around Earth Day. The message is, if you care about climate change, vote. I've been around for so many Earth Days now and written about them so long. The question is always, well, what do we do? Once you get people to care, and most people do care, by the way. Most people around the world, I think you'll affirm this, Tony, but I certainly found it anecdotally true when I was reporting for Earth Odyssey. People care. Of course they care about the food and the water and the soil and the air being clean. The only thing that gets in the way of that for most people is poverty. They say, well, I've got to put food on the table tonight first. But people care a lot. And so they say what to do. What can you do? Well, recycling, that's good. Riding your bike instead of having a car, that's good too. But there is nothing, I would argue, more powerful that you can do as a person than to vote and help other people vote. And there's a very interesting data point on this. I don't know if it's supported by your work, Tony. I'd be very curious to hear. There's a group called the Environmental Voting Project, and they argue that environmentalists actually vote less than the general population, which is saying something, because in the United States, it's effing shameful how few people vote. We're at like 55% of the electorate bothers to show up. In Europe, that would be like impossible, basically. 80%, 90% of people vote. So even less than that are the environmentalists. And these are environmentalists these are people who are, writing a check. They're writing a check to the Sierra Club or the Audubon Society or Greenpeace or whatever. They cannot be bothered to go out and vote. And if you vote, if those people vote, this is what the data they claim shows. So I'd be really curious to hear what you say about this, Tony. They say that you will flip elections if those people came out and voted and voted for candidates who support strong environmental action. Is that your...
So yes, Environmental Voter Project is right, and there's also a really important human behavioral element to this, is that once people vote once, they're now in the system, and so the parties now start to know that they are there and that they have voted, and thus they will now spend money to continue to get them to vote, and they start to develop the habit of going to vote. Like we are people, we form habits. And if you've never gone before and you don't know where the voting thing is, and I got all these other things to do, because we don't make it convenient in this country. That's a whole other form of controlling the voting population, of politicians choosing their voters and not the voters choosing the politicians. Right. So there are definitely structural barriers sometimes in the place. But the other thing is that the voters are not the ones that EVP or Environmental Voter Project is focusing on, who aren't voting, don't tend to be the people who are writing checks. Those are the people who tend to be super voters. It tends to be young people and people of color and people who don't have the means or have had their votes suppressed. Yeah. So, and it turns out that while many people presume that the people who care the most about climate change are white and well-educated and upper income, latte-sipping liberals, it's not true. It's actually what we show is that it's people of color, and in particular Latinos, who are the most engaged with this issue, but they don't vote on it because they don't have this history of voting oftentimes. So it's just to say there's a lot of effort now trying to think about how do we engage those particular groups.
Well, this is one of the stories we're trying to get our colleagues to do. Very sort of simple civics 101 as part of the, cover the elections with the climate lens. How do you get yourself registered? Where do you go to vote? Very basic stuff. It used to be the government would do that, but the media used to do that too. League of Women Voters used to do that, but nobody has a voice as big as the mainstream media. And even though, yes, of course, a lot of people, especially probably people of this generation in this room, are getting news off of TikTok and so forth, TikTok gets a lot of, it's social media. Where do you think most of that news comes from? It comes from the mainstream news organizations. So we're hopefully going to make some progress on that.
Yeah. So I know we've got a great audience here, so let's open it up to questions from all of you.
And don't feel worried. You can ask a very critical question. I'm a reporter. It is impossible to offend me.
That's not a challenge, by the way.
No, not a challenge.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Katya. I'm a joint degree student here at the School of Management and over at the School of Environment. So my question, I took a course last semester on environmental risk communication over at the School of Environment. And a lot of our conversation in that class throughout the course was talking about how trust is instrumental to communication. I don't have any data on this, so maybe you guys can help me out, but anecdotally and through kind of the media, I think there's heard stories that there's been erosion of trust in the American public, both with the media, like you mentioned, to be able to provide accurate, unbiased information, misinformation, disinformation, also lack of trust in the government to be able to act in the public's best interest, or even that the systems that are in place are fair and just, and then also trust in each other, potentially also after the COVID pandemic, and just that we're a solid unit. So I'm curious how that plays into communication about the climate and how you see our society moving forward from here and rebuild.
I think you should start.
Oh, thanks.
I mean, I can talk about a bit.
So first of all, it's important to distinguish the United States from the rest of the world. The rest of the world, thankfully, in this case, is not like the United States. The United States is an exceptional country in more ways than one. So that's really important, because the second thing I want to add to that is that what you're describing is true. Trust in journalists, trust in mainstream news, and so on is at historic lows. Trust in Congress and the president, and so on, is at historic lows, et cetera. But that's kind of at the end of, and I'm sorry for the metaphor here, at the end of the pipeline, because a lot of that is engineered. There's a reason why people don't trust the media. There's a reason why people don't trust government. And that's because there has been a multiple generational, very sophisticated, very well-funded, and from a communication science standpoint, not endorsing this, it's morally reprehensible, but from a scientific standpoint, wow, you have to be impressed. Disinformation, misinformation, and we can even use the word propaganda campaign to undermine trust in science, in education, in government, in now the judicial system, and it's not just the most recent presidential candidates and so on, though that's certainly an accelerant. This has been going on for a generation. And so these are some of the same forces that have been very active as a strategy to undermine public confidence in climate science, because they see climate science as a threat to their fundamental business model. This is about business. This is about dollars and cents. In the case of climate change, we're talking particularly about the fossil fuel industry, which are the biggest, wealthiest corporations and sector of the economy globally. And they are perfectly happy with the status quo. Thank you very much. Okay? And they want to maintain that status quo and, in fact, grow that status quo as much as they can. So it's just to say, yes, absolutely, trust is vital, and there's a reason why they have targeted trust. It's because it serves their interests. You may have additional thoughts about that.
No, it's quite right. I would add, though, that that campaign, which does date back to the 1970s, why did they do that? It was partly because of brave and crusading journalism in the case of Watergate and in the Vietnam War and the Pentagon Papers, and a guy named, what was the guy's name, that Supreme Court Justice Powell. Justice Powell wrote a memo that became the planning memo for we have to push back against what was seen as this liberal takeover of society. And that's where it all began, was responding to when the press was acting in the way that the founders intended, they pushed back against this. And I think Now, here's the positive spin on this. One of the things we're saying at Covering Climate Now is if you want, news organization X or Y or Z, if you want to regain trust, which you better, because you're not going to have a business model if you don't, one of the ways to do that is to be out there on climate change, because it's what people care about. It's especially what the rising generations care about. And if you can do good work on that and show that you're standing up to these corporations and to the deniers, and which I'm sorry to say include most of one of the two major political parties of this country, if you can do that, you will get not just trust, but you will get readers and therefore revenue. And the best example of that is the Guardian newspaper. And by the way, any of you, if you want to really be up to date on what's going on with climate, you cannot do better than to read the Guardian every day, Guardian USA, and it's free, but their business model, it's like an NPR model, and it works very well, and it works because of this. If you can pay, please do, but we're going to make this free for everybody because we believe in an engaged public. And as a result of that, the people who do pay, God bless them, I'm one of them, they then they get so many readers that attracts philanthropic and advertising support, which in turn helps them to do that kind of journalism to get more readers. So you can be a part of this, and I urge you to consider doing that.
So just last point on this, trust is easy to lose, but you have to earn it back. And there was an old commercial for those who are a little older in the room that may remember the E.F. Hutton had this wonderful actor, John Gielgud, I believe it was, who used to say, "We earn money the old-fashioned way. We earn it." Okay? And you have to work for it. Yeah. But the way to earn it is to be relevant to people's lives.
Right.
And this is, I would argue, is one of the few advantages that climate change has as an issue.
Yep.
Because we're talking about the life support systems of the planet. Every single human being, every single human endeavor, and not even just humans, all more than human life on this planet, has a direct and real stake in the outcome of this particular issue. And so it's not, and this is, maybe you can comment on this, for years, climate change was stuck in one of three ruts, narrative ruts, but really media ruts. This is a science story, and most people don't read the science section. This is an environment story, as in like this polar bears, and again, most people don't read that either. Or this is a politics story of they say this, they say that. Okay? And it is all of those. But what really marks climate change separately than I think almost any other issue is that it's so fundamental, it touches everything and everyone. So it's not just a science, environment, and politics story. It's a real estate story. It's a health story. It's a faith and religion story. It's a jobs and economics story.
It's even a sports story.
It's even a sports story. So
if you care about the Winter Olympics, Anyway, we should probably take some more questions because otherwise we'll just filibuster the whole time here.
Yeah. Right now throughout this conversation, we've talked about kind of climate change as sort of like the big, like single monolithic topic. But I think I remember reading maybe a few years back that essentially it's like, if you talk to people on such a big global scale of it, like they just kind of tune out, right? Or like if you talk about carbon emissions, that's like for most people it's not very intuitive at all, and so instead it's like more effective to like talk to them about the local issues, like local weather patterns, or to local soils, or like the effect of vegetation, things that people feel connected to. So I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on just like how do you balance between both that kind of local micro scale with the big overarching existential threat.
When we are training the journalists at CBS and NBC, local TV stations across the country, we drill in over and over the mantra that there are three keys to doing good climate coverage. Humanize the story, localize the story, and solutionize the story. Obviously, that's not a proper English word, but you know why I'm saying that. And humanize, again, it's like if all you're talking about is parts per million, that can fly on a campus like this where you're all, highly educated, but it goes right over the heads of most people. Instead, show me, I'm thinking right now of a gentleman I wrote about in a book. Show me the gentleman in the southern coast of Bangladesh whose house has just disappeared because of excessive floods. And he's holding his daughter, who happened to be the age of my daughter at the time. And I said, well, is she going to go to school someday? You want her to go to school? And he said, oh, very proudly, yes, I sure hope so, but it won't be here because this village will be gone. Show me that man, right? Humanize the story. And even though that's far away in Bangladesh, if I put you in that place and in his shoes, you feel that local situation. And then solutionize it, meaning, okay, what do we do? The most important thing we do is to cut the emissions. And by the way, this is a really critical point. It is true that we have made huge progress on green energy in recent years, largely, well, I should say, accelerated by the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act and so forth, to build out green energy. That's great, but it's not the most important thing, and it will not matter if we don't do the most important thing, which is to stop burning oil and coal and gas. You can have as much green energy as you like. If we stay on the track that we are with the dirty energy, we're going over the cliff. And for your generation in particular, as Tony said, you look at ExxonMobil, you look at Shell, you look at Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabian state company. They are going to burn down the planet if you let them. They are going to destroy your futures if you let them. That is their business plan. That is their business model. They are quite open about it. Literally last week they were laughing at an industry conference at the idea that we're ever going to get rid of, phase out oil and coal and gas. These people, I would argue, are criminals. They are committing crimes against humanity. And if you and your generation, if you sit there and let them do it, they will do it. So recognize the situation that you're in and get active.
Okay, in the back.
How do we allay concerns and help out people who are going to be affected by the transition from fossil to green fuels? People who work in mines, people who work for the gas and oil companies. Obviously, they're going to lose their jobs. And this idea of, well, we can just retrain. We've heard that mantra for decades. And the retraining, for some people it works, for some people it doesn't. So how do we allay those concerns for those folks?
Excellent. Pardon me. That's an excellent question. It doesn't really have to do with media, but I will try to answer it. Although I can reference a really good story that our colleagues at CBS News did about this. They went down to Georgia to look at how the Inflation Reduction Act is playing out. And those workers down there are, that they've created hundreds of thousands of jobs. Now, you're right, though, that there are some places where, if the economy has for decades, like in West Virginia or Kentucky or Texas or Louisiana, where I've done a lot of reporting, there's going to be cost to that transition. And that's why the Biden administration, when it put together the Inflation Reduction Act and the other measures, they are saying we're going to take 40% of the spending, and it's going to be directed at both frontline communities who are on the sharp end of the spear as far as the impacts, but also the workers and the communities who are going to have to transition. But you have to be serious about that. You can't just pay lip service to it. And I think they are serious about it, but it's got to be sustained over time. You can indeed retrain, and you can actually pay better. And one of the other things, of course, Biden, as a pro-union president, has insisted that those be union jobs. But that's not going to happen over just a couple of years here. That's why one of the reasons why this election in November is really important. If Trump comes in, all of that stuff goes away, right? The other thing about that is that there are, it's naughty politics, and there are some unions who are opposing all of this on these grounds. And so you have to have a genuine commitment with real dollars. And I think there is a genuine commitment in real dollars, but you have to make that work on the ground. And that's not easy. That's part of the place where reporters have to be there to be accountable. We shouldn't be cheerleading for the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a government program. We have to make sure that that money is actually being spent the way it's intended to. Yeah.
Thank you for the response to that question. You mentioned briefly when you started to respond that it wasn't really related to the media, but I see one way it is that I'd like to encourage media to take and run with, because talking to groups working with Latino communities in Texas, they said, my community knows what it looks like to work in the fossil fuel industry and bring home a check and have a solid way of making a living. And they don't know what it would look like for them and their community to be having a check and making a living in renewables? And how can you tell that story? How can you find examples of people who are already there and tell their story so that everyone can see them and identify with them?
Well, we have to tell those stories, but it's interesting you say that about Texas. People think of Texas as an oil state, which of course it is, but Texas is also a leading solar and wind state. So if those people are saying they haven't seen that, I suspect that will be changing because there's a lot of investment going in there. And by the way, it's interesting, 86% of the dollars that are being, the billions of dollars that are being spent on the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate stuff, 86% of that's going into red districts. Very interesting. I doubt that is coincidental. Well, of course, that doesn't stop the congressmen and women and governors who opposed it from showing up at the ribbon cuttings. Yes?
I'm going to build on Derek's point a bit about bringing the climate communications to the people, not losing them on the way.
Yeah.
Do you feel that, especially in the U.S. that is so incredibly politically divided, moving from talking about carbon emissions to nature and biodiversity, especially now with TNFD coming out, and biodiversity goals, that is something that is less contentious to the people and is more uniting, and so focusing on those stories would be more helpful, would bring out more people and more support?
I'd like to hear Tony's views on this. I think it is good, and there is broad-based support for that. But I also think that the polarization is overstated, and it is overstated by, unfortunately, too much of the mainstream media because they are basically echoing what Trump and his, supporters are saying about it. And they are, as Tony said, they're loud, but they are a minority. Donald Trump is supported by about 25 to 30% tops of the country. But they are loud, right? 25 to 30%. That's not enough to win an election. But if you follow media coverage, certainly until at least the State of the Union address, the dominant message, implicit and explicit, is that Biden's going down, Trump is going to win. Nobody really supports him, and people, Trump's ahead. Well, there's a big difference, and this is where I want you to talk, Tony. I'm really curious. There's a big difference between how people vote and how people are polled. And if you look, Trump has lost every election that he's run. He lost the popular vote in 2016. He lost in 2020. He's also lost in the 2018, 2022, 23, with the people that he endorsed. So I'm not so sure that there's as much polarization on this as at least assumed. But Tony, you know better.
Well, I know we're just at about time, so I will just quickly say that to your question, turns out everybody loves nature.
Yep.
Even conservative Republicans, evangelicals, pro-Trump, MAGA, like the idea of more trees. Okay? So there are ways to do this. In fact, in our studies, one of the policies that gets by far the most support from liberals, moderates, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, everybody, is actually support for helping farmers adopt more climate-friendly practices that will absorb and store more carbon in the soils and improve fertility and so on. So like really engaging the farming community and the industry not as a villain, but actually helping them become climate champions. And that's a narrative I would just like to end on, is that there are things happening out there, and you've already heard me be very critical of the fossil fuel industry. Turns out the fossil fuel industry also has the tools and the knowledge and the skills to be, that they could be leading the charge on developing new energy sources like geothermal. Because what do you need to do? You need to drill really deep, and you need to be able to pull heat energy out of the Earth's crust, okay? Who do we know that has the money and the resources and the infrastructure and the skills, and it's like incredible technological know-how to be able to do that stuff, okay? Turns out a lot of that is sitting in the fossil fuel industry, but they have not fully adopted that because they are still clinging to this old business model because it's still working, right? So it's just to say, I think there are ways that we can even see that quote-unquote villains could become champions and could become heroes in this larger narrative, but that's going to be part of this transition too. So I would be remiss if I didn't just quickly say we actually have our own climate news service called Climate Connections, that does exactly what you're talking about, is try to help people make the connection between this abstract idea and our lived reality, and not just how it's impacting us, but how people, everyday people, are rolling up their sleeves to be part of the solution. So I'd encourage you to look at that, and we're very proud members of Covering Climate Now. And with that, tie together, thank you so much for coming.